engineers and people building stuff are in pain. And they're in pain only because of abstraction and tooling problems. And that makes me like fundamentally angry in a productive way. Like the Sith Lord of dev tools.
Hi everyone, welcome to this episode of Breaking Changes. I'm really excited to have Nick Schrock, who many of you might know as the co-creator of GraphQL. You may know him from the GraphQL movie. He also is the founder of Elemental now, the creator of Dagster. Am I saying that?
We actually renamed ourselves to Dagster Labs. So,
right.
Yeah.
I knew there was something that I remembered wrong. There is a now 12-year-old photo of me and Nick doing programming from the Facebook office.
You're digging that out. All right.
Yeah. Maybe we can put it on the page for this episode. Maybe it could just be the album cover of the entire podcast series. Do podcasts have album covers?
A deep cut, yeah.
Yeah. All right. So Nick, let's start by telling everybody a little bit about your background.
Yeah, you kind of covered it a little bit, but I can dig in a little more detail. I guess I'll start in 2009 when I joined Facebook. It's kind of engineer 200 or so. And I ended up kind of working on naturally careening towards working on core abstractions in our product stack. That ended up, then we formed a team called Product Infrastructure, and its mission was to make our application developers more efficient and productive. So that initially started working on these frameworks in PHP to structure the data fetching of the site more efficiently and more productively. But that ended up expanding into front end and then expanding into open source projects. So React came out of that group. And one of the co-founders of React is Pete, who's the CEO of Dagster Labs. And then, the work that I did around the data fetching stack really culminated with GraphQL, which then also got it open source. And both of those are broadly used technologies, which have been really awesome to see. In 2017, I left Facebook, figuring out what to do next. And I was talking to companies inside and outside the valley about what their biggest technical liabilities were. And this notion of data infrastructure kept on coming up over and over and over again. As I dug into it, I like to say it was the biggest mismatch between the criticality and complexity of a problem domain and the tools and processes to address that domain that I've ever seen. The only thing that came close, in my view, was web dev prior to, say, 2010, before the browsers were good, before React, before TypeScript, before like this entire stack of tools. And, you really like move forward 10 years from 2010 to say 2020 or even 15 years to now. And like, it's a complete night and day. Like front-end engineering is awesome now. I mean, everyone complains about it. The JavaScript community is super dramatic, but like all that aside, it really has been a massive leap forward. And it was very clear to me that was needed in data and ML engineering. And the thing about it is that, it shared a lot of the properties that I care about when thinking about what software I want to build on or work on. One, it's like kind of this like core thing, which is engineers and people building stuff are in pain. And they're in pain only because of abstraction and tooling problems. And that makes me like fundamentally angry in a productive way. Like the Sith Lord of dev tools. And then it's a super horizontal. It's a problem that matters. Well, like I say, it's a super horizontal problem. Every company addresses it, and also like it determines very fundamental things in society. Like at the end of the day, what Dagster is doing is making data pipelining better. But data pipelining is like the basis of data assets to determine whether we get loans or not in a ML system about mortgage approvals, or like how we price healthcare, or like how we make business decisions. Like it's a basis of like nearly most most human-driven decision-making processes and increasingly automated decision-making processes. So it's like a foundational component of society, and it's all a huge dumpster fire.
Oh
So I
yeah,
thought
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the data's not clean. No one knows where it came from. Random stuff shows up in the data.
that's right, right. And there's no like, it's a completely dysfunctional software engineering process around it too. And I think like it's like that manifests in that the outputs of these things are untrusted. Um, and the other thing I like, the other thing is I felt like, kind of pushing on this domain, came up with like a novel technical abstraction, which is very motivating to me. And then lastly, found a spot in the domain that is a strategic point of leverage in the organization. And that's similar to GraphQL. Like GraphQL is this like kind of very powerful leverage point if fully adopted, because it is a software layer that intermediates all clients from all backends, and it provides a unified schema over that. Or the orchestration layer in data platforms kind of can serve a similar function if properly conceived, because the orchestration layer, which invokes every single computational runtime, which in turn touches every single storage layer, it's the thing that people have to plug into to like export lineage to the right spots. And then in the end, every single practitioner who's putting a data asset into production has to deploy their work into the context of an orchestrator at some point, because all this data comes from somewhere and goes somewhere. And so something has to schedule things so that you're not depending on data that's out of date and all this other stuff. So I think that orchestration was both, had that property of being an intense amount of pain and also a strategic point of leverage on multiple dimensions. So, that was a very long-winded answer. I kind of went into the why Dagster is interesting, but I'm an engineer. I work on dev tools. I work on dev tools for other engineers. I've tried to build products in other domains. Whenever I start building products, something offends me about the product stack that I work, the infrastructure stack that I work onto. So I was like, I can't help myself. So I decided to just like embrace my nature and just work on it full time at a company.
Yeah, I love it. No, that I'm similar in that dev tools just seems like it's the basic unlocking of all the other things in software.
That's right.
And
that's right. That's
also
why one of our company values is developers. It's like a throwback to Ballmer. You might not get that reference.
Yeah, no, I get our audience. Yeah, and believe it or not, so I, as you may know, come from academic programming languages, and every decade there's a major project on data lineage, data, like some kind of data organization, because someone realizes, oh my God, this is terrible. We need to fix it, and it's all the problems you described. And so, yes. I think there's huge need for abstraction in that space. I'm really glad that you are working on it. All right. So I was really excited to have you on this episode because I feel like you're a very impactful technical leader who strongly doesn't self-identify as an engineering leader. And we've had a few other examples of people like that on this episode. And, I think especially younger people in the industry, they think I have to decide, do I have impact by going down a management route, or do I do I stay in IC? And I think it's not always so binary. And so, hopefully throughout the course of this conversation, more of this will come out. But I'd love to have you describe a little bit of your current job right now and the kinds of things you do day to day.
Yeah, so I think the classic kind of trope here is one of player coach. When I was explaining to people the difference of, because I started out being, and I think we're going to get into this, but I started out being the solo founder CEO of Dagster Labs, and moved on to be the CTO. And to me, the role, it's kind of like in American football, the difference between being a coach and the quarterback. So when you're the coach, you're not on the playing field, right? Your kind of job is to like mentor the entire administration, the admin staff, as well as mentor the players, right? And you kind of think of like the coaching staff as the management stack, and then the players in the field is like almost like the IC stack, so to speak. And I want to be the quarterback, not the head coach. So that means like I lead. It's my job to lead and make tough decisions. I'm not dealing with the administrative aspects, but I'm still making strategic decisions and have to understand what's going on. But it's not like I'm like, I don't think, like Tom Brady goes and talks to his offensive lineman about his career path.
I really like that analogy. And yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I feel that since selling Akita, I've been in a similar situation where, now like our team is a startup within Postman. And instead of having to be everyone's coach, I'm like, just doing things. Although I guess I still talk to everyone about their career paths. So never mind. I'm not in the same boat, but I like your analogy.
That was just an example. I do care about the people I work with career, and like we'll give them we'll offer advice if asked, but my job is to score the touchdown.
Yep. Yeah, I would say I'm sort of like just like the coach, like the third base coach now. My job is just third base. Really, like a really good job on third base. Yeah. All right. Cool. So I want to dig into some of the juicy stuff. You've been behind several major projects over the course of your career. People know you from GraphQL. So I'd love to talk about, how did GraphQL come about? Was it originally Facebook specific, or did you start out saying this is going to be something for everybody?
It was super Facebook specific. So the story of GraphQL, a couple of years leading up to GraphQL, I was the tech lead on this internal system called Ent, which was effectively Facebook's business object layer. And a couple novel characteristics. Yeah. It had a couple novel characteristics, both because of the properties of Facebook itself as a product and the tech stack. So it had a few novel features, but that ended up being kind of built up into this more higher level declarative query language. And then effectively what happened is that we had to rebuild the mobile apps from scratch circa 2012. It was a massive company priority because we had previously built all the mobile apps in HTML5. That was not working. The shift to mobile was massive. We were about to go public. We thought that if we didn't nail the mobile thing, the entire company would go to zero. So there's kind of intense pressure there. We had hired a team of devs from iOS, a lot of Apple folks, to build the iOS app, and they understood iOS very well. They knew how to build iOS products beautifully. They did not understand Facebook's stack. So they had like prototype this thing on top of our external facing platform, which was like, there's no way you could build the app on top of that. So one of the other engineers, dear friend of mine, Bo Hartshorn, who's kind of a more OG Facebook guy, he started stopping by my desk like every other day. He's like, Nick, I don't know what you're working on, but like you shouldn't care about it. This is the most important thing. Like you're the one who needs to come in and fix this because like we're completely fucked. Like not just me I am, but also the company. So wow, let's do this. And I heard that 3 or 4 times. I'm like, okay, maybe we start working on it. And then I don't know, it's kind of one of these things where it was a bit of a moment of inspiration, I guess. I saw what was going on. I was like, we should just like build the query language as thin as wrapper as possible on top of this internal abstraction that's already working. And so effectively I kind of built a prototype pretty quickly. And its entire purpose was to effectively serialize what the work we had done on our internal data fetching stack and then overlay a minimal type system on top of that. Super minimal type system. And I initially called it Super Graph. I like tried to bring a bunch of stakeholders and prototype it, and then got a couple people excited about it. And then we were, off to the races, but like, we were really under the gun. Like the prototype I wrote in like late February, we were supposed to ship the iOS app in May, so we only had a couple months to build this thing. So an incredibly intense period to build it under the gun. And like the goal of that was to power iOS, the feed on the iOS app, with a eye towards powering the entire iOS app, and then all the mobile apps. But even the original prototype diff, I was kind of like, this should be the basis for we could use the system to power the entire website as well. So certainly had like visions across, like, I was very convinced that, had effectively like been like, oh, this is actually a really interesting, novel, generalized technology within the Facebook ecosystem. And then later, especially when we saw the popular React, that was kind of like well, how generalizable is this thing now? Because it'd be really cool to be able to export a lot of this work that we're really proud of to external developers, see how it goes. So that's the GraphQL story.
Cool. So Nick, was there any resistance internally at all to, adopting this whole new abstraction under already tight deadlines?
There was internal. So the platform team was very skeptical of this approach. They, because they wanted to evolve FQL, which is a SQL-like syntax on top of Facebook's. They wanted to evolve that to power the iOS app. I was very confident that wasn't going to work. Most importantly, all the people building the product were very confident that wasn't going to work. So initially, right, I think this is a good lesson here, is that we didn't convince everyone, right? We convinced the people who mattered at that time, which were the people building the iOS feed, right? The people building the app were like, we can move much more quickly doing this. Like, this team is super responsive. We're really excited about this technology. And to Facebook's credit, it had a culture where if infrastructure providers were service orgs, and it was their responsibility to convince and persuade people to use their technology. And if they couldn't, it wasn't like Schrepp, our CTO, always like came down. I was like, no. You kids have to get along with the rest of everyone else and use what everyone else is. Like, there was a lot of allowing for internal, internal teams to control their own destiny. So, we started out with one team who was really a very motivated customer and also extremely leveraged, because the feed, and that was accidental, but it was what was mattered at that point. But the nature of feed was that it's so interconnected to the rest of the company. Like, feed is where everyone jams, all the different product teams want to jam stuff into feed to get distribution for their product. So the moment that you have the feed architecture, then everything spreads organically to the rest of the app.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so once because of the feed team approached you, you sort of had your first customer built in, and then that success really just
the GraphQL problem was that it spread too quickly. We got adoption too quickly because also there was intense pressure from Zuck around this stuff because he wanted everything to be a native app as quickly as possible. So he'd like go to and in his mind, like, GraphQL was like the thing that allowed native apps to happen. So like, he just like go to the team. He like just like wander about and like walk to the timeline team and be like, why isn't it native yet? And then that would be like cause intense pressure to be like, okay, we need a GraphQL endpoint for this, blah, blah, blah. It took over the org very quickly. That was a relatively unusual situation because of those confluence of factors.
Yeah. What was the process of migrating non-GraphQL endpoints to GraphQL? Like, how much of that was there? Or was it just people were just spinning up new endpoints so quickly, and those were GraphQL, and that just took over that way?
Well, they just had existing. I mean, a lot of it, they were just built. It wasn't even migration, right? Because like they were like building these pages from scratch.
Yeah.
So it wasn't even like they were migrating. There was like, oh my God, like, the Facebook data model is actually incredibly complicated. So they have this like all this intense hierarchical data of like interests have this and blah, blah, blah. And then don't even talk about feed. Like, feed has like nested stories and it's crazy. So like they just look at it and like they couldn't even like it's like, well, we can't use FQL because the data's out of date, because like the external developers care about different stuff than the internal developers. I can spin up my own custom endpoint, but like my brain would explode thinking about all the stuff I need to fetch in order to do that. Or there's this new thing which is rough, but like it has this declarative, it has this tool where I can recursively explore the graph and that like directly matches to the views I want to render. GraphQL GraphQL sold itself partially because it wasn't it wasn't a migration. The other part about it is that it was so directly stacked on top of this Ent framework, which is already powering all the main applications in the app, that someone who, if you're a product engineer and you're like moving from rendering this page in HTML to rendering this page in iOS, at minimum, at least a data model was familiar and literally reusing the same code that you used to render the original thing. So you could kind of like even like look at the code in PHP and like kind of like pretty easily like envision like, oh, that's how this looks in GraphQL. Okay. Like, incrementally building this on the existing stack, I think was also very important.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. What was the process of getting GraphQL adopted outside of Facebook? Like, was that something that you guys pushed, or people just started asking for it?
No, we wrote the spec. I was very skeptical of open sourcing GraphQL, by the way. Like, well, it's funny. Yeah. I was one who convinced Lee, one of the co-creators. I was like, oh, we should open source this thing. And then he like went on like some sort of spirit quest and came back and was like, well, we should open source it, but we should do a version 2 of the language and only open source a spec. And that's what we should do. And I'm like, what the fuck are you talking about? But he was totally, like we were open sourcing a document, right? Without any reference implementation in JavaScript that was totally untested. So we had to like rely on all these people building their own custom backends and all the different programming languages. Actually, building a GraphQL backend is really challenging. So we kind of like, we pushed out the spec. We gave a conference talk. We gave a few conference talks and we kind of like let it go on its own. But some other startups kind of picked up around this and started doing the grunt work sort of dev around it. Like Apollo in particular was like very active and pushing. They were former Meteor. They were the Meteor folks, and they basically pivoted to be a GraphQL company because they saw GraphQL as like unifying abstraction that could power all the client, their fancy live rendering client software they wanted to do.
It is like the Meteor for the times.
So them and like Johannes, who founded GraphQL, so kind of we kind of released it into the front end community, and it kind of got a lot of uptick, and we were able to ride the React bandwagon, and then combination of some visionaries, like Jeff and Matt and Apollo, and the GraphQL folks and Hasura were kind of early on the on that bandwagon too. So I wasn't like, I didn't spend 2 years like hopping from conference to conference. I kind of moved on with my life.
That makes sense. What was the moment in time rise that led to the rise of GraphQL? Was it React, as you said? Was it React plus other factors?
So I think GitHub adopted it for their public API. I think that was like a big GraphQL moment. And then at some point, meetups started, and it kind of started to grow organically. I actually think the founders of the startups around GraphQL actually probably have a better instinct for the exact inflection points, because they're the one monitoring metrics and like so ironically, like I was like kind of detached from the GraphQL growth story. Like I knew it was like picking up momentum and stuff, but I wasn't actively driving the dev route, like really strategizing about how to drive adoption.
Okay. No, that makes a lot of sense. All right. Well, let's move on to talking about Dagster. So we already started talking about it a little bit. So I'd love to have you frame the Dagster vision in terms of a breaking change. So if Dagster is successful, what is the breaking change that you would introduce into the industry?
So the breaking change you introduce in the industry is to reconceive the orchestration layer at data platforms, which is like the basic for data pipelines, to not be a task-oriented layer, but to be a asset-oriented layer. So instead of just stringing together imperative tasks to build data pipelines, instead you declare that the data assets that you want to exist in code And then the act of running a data pipeline is kind of reifying that software definition into physical materializations that correspond to that. So it follows like patterns of like infrastructure as code projects like Terraform, like a move from like imperative scripts to a declarative software defined infrastructure. The popular phrase infrastructure as code, but I much more strongly prefer the term software defined infrastructure. Or like Kubernetes in the container orchestration space, very similar story. Doing that, but for the data domain. And what that means is, it solves this immediate problem of it's a better developer experience, right? And also it's not only asset oriented, but also we're like very geared towards making the orchestrator really think about the software development lifecycle as a first class principle. Most of the orchestrators kind of like don't think about like a local development workflow. Just like you kind of like string together some scripts and push and pray. I don't believe in that. But the asset orientation is a little more profound in terms of the way that the organization conceives of and values the orchestration layer. Because if you think about it, if you build your data pipelines in terms of data assets, you effectively have a novel new system of record because you have a index of the software definitions of your assets. We also have a metadata system that we attach to that. So we like build this immutable event stream that you can end up basically attaching metadata events to the each of these assets we define in software. So you no longer need just to do the basic notion of like locating an asset and figuring out who owned it and the last time it was updated. You don't need a separate data cataloging product, right? It's just like built into the orchestrator. And it's not like it's like an unnatural expansion into an adjacency. We would literally have to fight ourselves to not have a built-in data catalog. It's a primary abstraction of the system. Similar with like lineage. Like it isn't a separate lineage tool. It's just like you have to build lineage in order to build the data pipeline. So that's your lineage tool, right? Yeah. And then also naturally we have data quality features. So, there's still an ecosystem of these things, but I like to call it like our orchestrator is like data quality curious, meaning like it's like aware of data quality, but like you can invoke any data quality library to the body of the test, but there's one place to assemble the information and present it in a single unified view. And just like in the same way as like once you're in the system, it's like so obvious that it should be in the system because like you have a green check mark that says like the last time this ran was at this date and it succeeded. And then there's also another check mark that's like, oh, it passed this data quality test. It's like very natural to co-locate that information. So, we think really this moves orchestration from like just a pure utility that does a very specific task to a control plane for your data platform that's very data centric. And specifically data asset centric is the way we kind of think about it. And it makes it so that, we're kind of iterating our messaging a bit. So it's been testing this, but like, in fact, there's like impedance mismatch in the data platform ecosystem where all the other surrounding tools and capabilities all think in terms of data. And then you have the central glue layer. And if that thing has no notion of data, all the different other tools and all the users of those tools are constantly mapping this data came from this task and therefore you have to do this. And then you have to like push out this data out to this system separately. And like the integration costs are super high. Whereas if you have this new system of record for all the software definitions of your assets, you can kind of hang off all the metadata in the system off of that thing. And it just makes integration way easier. Provide a new cohesive experience. That's what we're trying to do.
Makes a lot of sense. Cool. So Nick, you're really early to this in some ways. And also this isn't something that, front end devs or back end devs necessarily think about because you don't encounter it day to day in software development. So how did you convince your early team to join you to work on this?
That's a good question. I kind of chose a mix of people that are like the team was a mix of people who had deep domain expertise in data pipelining or done this sort of work. Cause like, I was like data adjacent at Facebook in terms of like ML and data pipelining. But it wasn't my day-to-day life. So effectively, like, you got a mix of people who like bought into the vision of like, this is a good way of like structuring data pipelining, and it identified with the problem and I could solve it.
Yeah.
Combined with also some people, especially new from Facebook, colleagues of mine who love working on dev tools and were kind of up for working on a new interesting problem space with people they wanted to work with. You know, for some people, it's like, for them, it was like choosing a problem that they super identified with, that they had lived, and they kind of like instinctively understood the opportunity. And then another set of people who like I had previously worked with, we knew we loved working together. We all like doing the same stuff. And I just kind of convinced them like, hey, I know this is like a domain shift, but like I just did this, and like there's lots of interesting problems to solve. And there's kind of like, you know, the opportunity here to have big of impact is React or GraphQL, one of those projects that we're really proud of. So it was kind of a mix of that. Like people have different motivations, right? So, but your job is to like assemble a team of people who are motivated by different things and have different interests. But coming out of that, you get like actually novel interactions with people. You know, I actually think a good analogy for building a startup is like being like a showrunner for a movie or TV show. Like you're assembling like people from like wildly different skill sets, but you need someone on the top who can like synthesize all these different skill sets and mind frames and assemble it into a cohesive product vision. And that's where like marketing comes in and that sort of stuff.
Yeah. So I'm also curious how lessons from GraphQL helped you in the early development of Dagster, or even now.
Yeah, I think a lot of the lessons, I mean, there's lots of incidental technical lessons, I guess, but I don't think those are as interesting as there is a lot of power in really being principled in thinking about what the end output of an engineer's job is and aligning the actual and the outputs and the outcomes they're trying to achieve and the software abstractions you're thinking about. So meaning like with GraphQL, right? You like look at a phone or you look at a web page and you can kind of like see that it's hierarchical, right? Like the data is like nested and like, you know, like that's like all the apps you ever use pretty much are nested and hierarchical, right? And then you kind of step back and you're like, well, if their end work product is hierarchical, why are they not interacting with the core data that they're going to render in this thing in a hierarchical manner, right? It just kind of like makes intuitive sense. And it actually makes intuitive sense to anyone, right? Like I could explain that to my mother and she'd kind of like get it, you know? So I still think having that sort of kind of step back and like thinking about the problem we're actually solving, it's like at the end of the day, what's a data engineer doing, right? Like what is their purpose? And their purpose is to construct like a set of data assets that their downstream consumers can depend upon and understand, right? And do so efficiently and like trust it and understand it. So starting from there, right? It's like, okay, well, their job is to recreate a graph of assets. Maybe they should be coding in terms of a graph of assets. And I think that sort of thinking leads to both kind of technically correct solutions as well as solutions that you can educate the market about. And that is marketing, right? Marketing is like a dirty word with developers and it shouldn't be considered, because with a highly technical product, marketing is education. And like every developer understands that like education is necessary. So if you like think that marketing is all about inventing a new buzzword or you don't like it, well, just think about it as like you're building a new thing. You need to educate people about it, which means you need super clear messaging and clean thinking around it.
I completely agree.
Yeah, it was interesting. One of my early engineers, I was like, he was making a slide deck about Dagster, and I'm like, because like at Facebook, like I knew product marketers existed. I had no conception of what they did, right? And I was talking to one of the engineers, and he's making a slide deck for a conference, and he's like, "Yeah, I feel like I'm doing two jobs right now. Like I'm doing the product marketing job and the engineering job." And to me, I had to it actually broke my brain for a second, because I'm like, how do you not think of building the slides that explains your technology as like your job? Like literally when I'm coding, sometimes I'm like visualizing the slide deck I would use to the slide I would use to explain it. Like it just like, it's so instinctively is like what I consider like part of my job that I like think about it up front. But yeah, anyway, that's I kind of went off.
Yeah, no, I think it takes a lot of years to train other people into thinking that way, for sure. I think, yeah, this is related to my next question is you've been at the forefront of a couple of movements now, GraphQL being one of them. And you're like, what you're doing with Dagster, I see as being super early to a lot of other data solutions as part of the whole AI wave. And so I'm really curious how you think about your relationship to I guess things like how do you find yourself, or how do you get yourself at the front of something that's about to become big? Like, do you think about it that way, or does it happen for other reasons? And then once it becomes big, how do you think about getting signal from noise in the hype, and how do you think about your relationship to that hype?
Yeah, that's a good question. I have a fairly simple approach to it, I guess. I do follow my instincts a lot. And so, in dev tools, I think there's a lot of value in just getting to ground truth of what the engineers are spending time on and what the engineering managers are stressed about. And a lot of the highfalutin market maps and all that stuff is downstream of that. I think there's also value in deeply understanding what is best practice at the leading engineering organizations. Because a lot of time, like the internal tooling stacks of like Facebook or Google, the hyperscalers are like, a decade ahead of what the external infrastructure, what the external world is using. It doesn't mean you just copy and paste what is going on there, because a lot of times you have to retranslate the underlying value to smaller organizations, which ends up taking the product a lot. So those are kind of like basic things, I guess. I'm not as much of a top-down, like a futurist, I guess, which I think leaves me other blind spots. But I don't know.
I feel like abstract futurism, this is very easy to miss the mark, like 1 out of like 1,000 visions of the future actually pan out, if that many.
Right. And I think that a lot of the futurists all talk to each other too, a lot of times. So and it's a classic thing where like, even if they're right, it's kind of like the, one of like a classic Steve Jobs interview where like a classic mistake people make is thinking the idea is enough. And like, really it's only once you actually do the work of building a product and living with it that you truly understand the constraints involved. And that's where the real like innovation happens. I mean, it's like, execution versus ideation is like a classic thing.
And
so
I
like getting involved and understanding what the problems are, and then like kind of building. It's the way my brain works. And
I like especially what you say about what the engineering managers are stressed about, because I feel like developers will ask for a lot of things. Developers will write about a lot of things on forums, but looking at like where's the actual pain coming from on the teams as a whole, I think is a really good way to look at things.
Yeah, and what's like the cross-cutting systemic complexity that everyone is running into that could potentially be solved by a new cross-cutting process, tool, or technology. So you have to like get away, like you have to remove the signal from the noise of like, well, this person's having this problem because like they actually just have incompetent engineers and they don't know what they're talking about. Versus like you're talking about other people who are like have like talented teams, but like they're still grappling with this. Like that's an indication of a tooling
Yeah,
problem.
yeah. And this was a big issue I had with how we thought about user testing. So in especially academic programming languages, because I feel like there's a lot of emphasis on user research with like individual developers. When you're looking at least like an academic, like, you know, we're going to develop this new programming method, and people are like, okay, did you test with developers? But it's a lot of this other stuff you're talking about. Like, do the managers actually care about it? How do the teams interact? And you can get some of that from user interviews with the managers and their managers and higher up, but it's actually information that you don't really get from watching developers or user testing with individual devs. And that's a big thing I've been thinking about a lot. Cool. So I alluded to the fact that we're going to talk about this. You alluded to the fact that we're going to talk about this, but I'm really curious about your decision to bring on an external CEO. Well, it's someone you knew already, but still, you know, not a Dagster co-founder. How did you know you didn't want to be CEO anymore? Is that something you always knew would happen going in? And how did you pick someone?
So I didn't know I was going to do it. It was kind of a combination of things. You know, some of this is just like being a solo founder is really hard. It's really hard under any circumstances, but you know, during this startup journey, I've had 2 young kids, moved a couple times, bunch of rough health issues, just things were like stacking up, and it was kind of, you know, I probably should have had co-founders from the beginning. So that's just like a raw, like technical thing.
Yeah, and, I was also a solo founder, and I also say I would only do it again with co-founders.
Yeah, absolutely. So that was one thing. You know, like I do like it's possible that before I was married and had kids and didn't really have a life and was a complete maniac, that I might have been able to do it as a solo founder, but like it was just too much. It's too much for one person. And the other thing is that, you know, I was able to persuade Pete to come on as head of engineering. I obviously had deep context with him for like 10 years. I was really privileged to be able to bring him on. And you know, he had already been a CEO of a venture-backed startup that like grew to 5 million ARR and sold to Twitter. Obviously, he had experience from React and doing large open source projects, had a lot of good instincts around DevRel and the product. He had lived this problem at Twitter and his startup, so domain experience. And just when he joined, it was clear very quickly that he was just better operationally than I was. And I was also not doing the things that I am actually uniquely differentiated at, which I think is this kind of cross product of technical communication, architecture, and execution on engineering. Yeah. And so I was like spending all my time doing stuff that like I don't want to do long term. And you know, there's only enough, like when you're a founder, there's like a certain amount of stuff that you have to do. Like you have a certain chunk of chores, and then like then there's all this other stuff where you want to do your like product work and whatnot. Between that and my personal obligations to life, I just like didn't have enough time to do what's going on. And yeah, so I just kind of, you know, it just kind of, I was, you know, what really happened out of all things, I guess I've never talked about this. I was listening to this YouTube video of Naval Ravikant, and you know, people like to make fun of Naval because like a very like, you know, startup wisdom, fortune cookie wisdom. But I actually think that he's underrated. I think Naval is really smart and has lots of interesting things to say. And he has this YouTube video that was like called like, "You don't need to be CEO." And he like listed, and it's hearing him talk deeply resonated with my life experience, and how like I was doing things in my professional life. Most of them I didn't want to do. I'd been doing that for a long time, and it was really ground me down. And Pete was there. I think he was excited to do the opportunity, or I believed he was excited to do the opportunity. And I think it would be better for every stakeholder, myself, for the employees, for all the investors, for him to do it. And I think I would have been personally happier too. So it just kind of like, it became obvious quickly at a little self-reflection that was the right thing to do. And then the transition went super smoothly. And the
that's awesome.
Increased its trajectory really quickly. He also had a bunch of credibility with the team already, both from previous relationships, but also, having like his performance as VP of engineering was like awesome. He like drove our GA launch basically. So yeah, that was kind of the story there.
Cool. Sounds like a win-win for everybody. All right. Well, we have reached the closing portion of our recording. So I'm going to ask a few hot take questions. The first of which is, what are the most underrated breaking changes in the industry right now?
I guess it's been defines how you do industry. I do think there is this ongoing, it's not just from Dagster, it's other people too, this kind of conversion of data engineering to being a proper software engineering discipline. I actually think is like incredibly important and impactful. It kind of is a meat and potatoes subject, but I actually think will have enormous impact up and down the stack for every component of the business. So I do think it's an underrated breaking change. In the industry.
I believe it. Yeah, we have a data infrastructure position opening up right now. We need data engineering on our team.
Yeah. I think like data engineering is like an incredibly important, underrated discipline.
Cool. So next I have to ask, what's your hot take on the breaking changes AI will introduce?
Oh boy, AI. So the AI is an underlying computing primitive. It's extremely powerful. And I'm excited to see how it gets combined in, especially in like kind of AI native use cases. I'm kind of in the middle of like a personal AI winter, AI bear status. Because right now we're in the stage of the hype cycle where every single SaaS app feels compelled to jam an AI feature into it. So you have this kind of like possessed demon now like spewing content everywhere in all things. So I think there's kind of this like a dystopian aspect to AI where you have like agents automatically generated content that are then sending content to other AI agents that are synthesizing that content. And you're in this kind of like unreality. Also, the commoditization of content creators is kind of like deeply disturbing because it's almost like this like AI could construct this like closed loop of content where like AI agents kind of capture the current creative output of humanity and then puts all the too many artists out of a job, and it just becomes a self-reinforcing loops of content being generated from other content, which is kind of this like.
Then you get likes from AI,
It's like this horrid manifestation of the singularity. So I, in terms of like, I'm very skeptical of multi-step, overcomplicated agents that claim to fully replace humans. Like I know the Devon guys are like brilliant. They're like won math competitions and when they're young and all this stuff. But I'm very skeptical of that approach. I think it'd be incredibly powerful.
I'll talk to you offline about my feelings about it.
The demos are amazing, right? But like, you just like listen to a podcast, like you listen to the All In podcast, which I actually really do like. But like, you have like Jason Calacanis on there, like freaking out about how like all the engineers are gonna be gone in 10 years and stuff. It's like, dude, I'm using Copilot and like it's useful, but also like doesn't complete my parentheses correctly a lot of times.
Yeah, so like this stuff I feel like is just atoning for the sins of broken abstractions. Like we haven't even gotten over those. Like how are we getting to the next level?
Yeah, I do think they're really compelling. Actually, an ex-employee of mine, ex-team member of Dagster, he like pitched me this idea of LLM native frameworks, which I think that is interesting, right? Where,
that is cool.
Where you think about like, okay, the human needs to encode information somewhere that only the human can, but then you instruct the human to construct the content such that it's very amenable to LLM generation of like other parts of the system. Like that is super interesting to me, right?
I'm
I'm like not an AGI person. So like this notion of a generalized intelligence that can replace humans,
I have
extremely skeptical.
Also views on AGI, Nick. I just feel like it's not very humble to say that humans are going to create something so much bigger that we can't even do.
It reminds me of one of my favorite lines is G.K. Chesterton. And he says, and I say this as a non-religious person, he says, when man stops believing in God, he doesn't believe in nothing. He believes in anything. And I think AGI is proof of that.
Yeah, accurate. All right. Next question is there a change, personal or professional, that you're excited about and willing to share with our audience?
So this year is my year of really focusing in a deliberate way on both mental and physical health. So I'm very excited to do that. Nice. I'm having back surgery next week because I'm having these back issues, and I'm getting a bunch of my health in order that I've neglected doing a startup for 5 years. I don't know if I'm going to flare. Who's the guy who's like trying to reverse his own aging? Is that Brian Johnson?
Oh my gosh. It's I'm not doing that. Brain tree person. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not, I respect what he's doing. I'm not going to make fun of him, but I'm not going to go that far. But like kind of like a Brian Johnson light is kind of my, within the Overton window, Brian Johnson.
Yeah. Okay. I'll keep checking in with you and be like, selfie, please. Cool. No, I think that's a great goal. I guess I have a similar goal, which is this year I travel again. Like just when I did Akita, just no international trips, no long trips, and getting back to that.
Nice.
Yeah. All right. So for anyone who wants to hear more from you, where can they find you? What can they read?
Yeah, so I think the two primary things are I'm on Twitter, so DMs are open. And
whoa,
I know, right? And then maybe I shouldn't say that. And then I live and breathe on the Dagster Slack, and then publish content on the Dagster blog, and so that's kind of where I'm at.
Cool. Thank you so much, Nick. It's been a lot of fun catching up.
Totally awesome. Thanks for having me.